So I love Devo. We all love. People always love Devo. But I was watching The Truth of De-Evolution, and there was a scene where they were driving. It looked like the old BF Goodrich buildings, but it was like there was around some factories, and they were
Yeah.
driving to a place, and they were getting out of the car, and it was before the song "Free Agent" came on, and there was this beat that was playing. It was like an electronic beat. It sounded like something that Trent Reznor would have done early on in Nine Inch Nails. It sounded like something that if I went to Vegas tonight and took a red eye and went to party at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would hear the same beat.
Yeah.
Tell, do you think that Devo doesn't get enough credit when it comes to electronic music? Because Kraftwerk, who are around the same time, they get a lot of credit for that, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
But do you think Devo really get enough credit for what they were doing experimental-wise when it comes to electronic music?
Probably not, because I don't think they were ever treated like primarily as an electronic band. They were treated, I think, more as a pop band, and I think they were their visual aspects overrode their technical aspect, but they definitely were. I mean, Mark Mothersbaugh was really like fascinated with early synthesizers and fearless with experimenting with them. And then later, when they had the means, and the makers were interested in connecting with bands like the Fairlight synthesizer. Devo was one of the first bands to use that in the studio. They liked to work with producers who were electronically adventurous, starting with Brian Eno and moving forward. So they probably don't get enough credit for their innovations. They also, as I mentioned earlier, they sort of experimented with a homemade electronic drum kit, which, before that was really even a thing. They just kind of made it up. So, they always embraced technology. And really, one of their downfalls, I think, is at some point they started to let the machines lead the cart instead of the cart bringing the machines along behind. So there was one point where like Mark Mothersbaugh, especially in the studio, was really experimenting with drum machines and so forth, alienating Alan Myers, who Jerry Casale calls the human metronome. I mean, you can't get, like he was almost machine-like in his precision anyway. So at some point, like so many things about Devo, what was good about them, it also became their downfall.
So let's go back. Let's go back to 1970. May the 4th, 1978, Kent State University is one of the saddest days in American history because the Ohio National Guard just opened fire, and I think 4 students got killed.
Yeah.
And sadly, members of Devo were friends for a couple of those students. And ironically enough, good or bad, Devo was born from that. Let's talk about that time on May the 4th for people who don't really know the history of Kent State and the birth of Devo from that tragic day.
Yeah. So in 1970, Jerry Casale and Bob Lewis, who was a founding member of Devo, and Mark Mothersbaugh were all enrolled at Kent State. Jerry Casale was politically active, sort of dabbled with the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, which was one of the radical protest groups, but not sort of fully all in as a student protester, but certainly in that circle. And Kent was, like a sort of a sleepy kind of small town campus. And so everybody kind of knew each other. So on that day, 2 of the students who were killed were friends with Jerry Casale. He saw it happen. It's Allison Krauss, his friend. He talks in really chilling terms about seeing this friend of his lying on the ground bleeding to death with a bullet wound through her head. I mean, so you take a young person in that situation, and especially young people who were like thinking about themselves as artists and thinking about a future, making a life, making art or music, and also thinking about, this is the baby boom generation, thinking about what's expected of them in this newly formed middle class, college experience that was really, you know, they're the first generation to really like embody that. You know, you get this is your next step to do better than your parents. And all of that comes into question in that moment. And I think Jerry especially has articulated it the best. And he says that that's the moment, he's described that quote as the most Devo moment in my life. Here is, you know, we've been dabbling around with this theory of de-evolution and making art and writing poetry about it. And here is hard evidence that we are not evolving as humans, that we are, that this is an inhumane act. And it's was done by our government, you know, to somebody who wasn't doing anything wrong. And so for him, and I think for kind of that generation, especially of artists at Kent State, but more broadly, you know, people in the, not just the pre-punk movement, but people who were starting to question this middle class expectation. It was just like, if I'm gonna make art, I'm all in, because I'm not going to do what society's expecting of me anymore. You know, I'm not going to do what the man thinks I should do when the man just did this. And also really politicized the idea of de-evolution, so that it wasn't just, you know, this quirky theory that they had found in a weird manifesto, but you know, that they were going to really test this anti-authoritarian, you know, sort of like work within the system to undermine the system kind of vibe that Devo really took on moving forward. So it was a tragedy that I think when you hear them talk about it to this day, and, you know, Chris Butler from the Waitresses was another one who was there, who was close friends with one of the students who was killed, and he talks about it too. You can still hear the quiver in their voice, you know, more than 50 years later, of how deeply it affected them and does to this day.
Who are some of their music influences?
Devo's music influences?
Yes.
Well, you just mentioned Kraftwerk. They were early adapters of Kraftwerk. You know, like Jerry was sort of into Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones and a lot of the English sort of mod era rock and roll. Mark Mothersbaugh was more into prog. He was, and, you know, like he was playing in a band before he joined Devo called God, G-O-D, all caps. I think it stood for something, but it was, you know, the band was called God. And it was a two-piece, him and a drummer, and he was playing like Emerson, Lake and Palmer kind of keyboards with this drummer, you know, but also, you know, kind of atonal electronic kind of stuff too. So definitely experimental. They were early into reggae, you know, just as reggae was becoming known. And again, I think I mentioned this before, the Satisfaction riff was actually, they were playing it around with it as playing it in a reggae kind of style. And you can kind of hear that chop, you know, that reggae it has as its backbeat. So yeah, Bob Mothersbaugh, the lead guitarist, was playing in a rock and roll bar, you know, R&B, blues, or rock cover band, you know, mainstream rock and roll. So all of them were definitely like in that generation of seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and that being the thing that made them want to pick up a guitar and to start playing music in the first place. So
you kind of forget, because the Bob Marley movie is out, and you kind of forget like what an impact reggae made on a lot of acts. Like you heard it in Blondie, you heard it with the Police, you heard it with the Clash. Like you kind of forget like what a major force. You know, people think like, oh, I'm going to a reggae concert, I'm smoking weed, I'm having a good time. But as a musical influence, it made a big impact on a lot of acts.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of Keith Richards' life, his autobiography, is when he talks about how reggae totally affected him, and he was spending time in Jamaica and really hanging out. Yeah, it was a major force.
So let's go to 78. So 78 deal was on SNL, right? I'm trying to get that right. I'm trying to get the timeline right.
That is correct.
So that same year, they came back to Akron and they did a performance.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Devo's back in town. Yay. They didn't perform again in Akron until 2008.
Right.
And they performed for a fundraiser with Chrissy Hind and the young Black Keys. So at that time, they were starting to explode.
Right.
I guess my initial question was going to be, why did it take so long for them to come back to Akron? But I have another question along with that. Is, do you see any similarities between the Keys and Devo? Not from a musical standpoint, but as far as the career trajectory and coming from Akron.
So to your first question, they were not nostalgic about Akron as their hometown. Jerry has a quote in the book where he says Akron was a good place to be from, and he says "from" very pointedly. Like, I don't think any of them were, in a different, like, the Black Keys have always kind of embraced Akron as part of their mythos, kind of their image, and they've used Akron images and references. And it wasn't like that for Devo, so I don't think there was like the sort of hometown impetus to play here. And plus, this was, they were coming of age as a concert act in the years of the Belkins and in Cleveland, and the Belkins would certainly be determining where their tours would stop in Northeast Ohio. And I think it was, always going to be Cleveland. So they certainly played Cleveland plenty of times, but coming back to Akron was, it was a special event. It was a fundraiser for the Democratic Party in the rise of Barack Obama. So there was a reason to come back, but they definitely have the other side of that has been Akron has always embraced them. And it's kind of ironic, that as I read in the book, probably 100 people even knew who they were when they left Akron. And now, that's one of our calling cards is, like now that they're famous and
it's funny, like Akron, we love our people. Like, we love you, LeBron. We love you, Devo. And they all go to LA. they all go across the country to get away from us. Well, we love them.
Yeah.
We won't always accept these folks with open arms. But who was like that? James Ingram left. They always go to the West Coast and just leave us behind.
Yeah.
Here's a thing that I was kind of, let's go back to the Stones. So the Satisfaction song, because I was curious about that, because their version of Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones was so different.
Yeah.
And they and they did a great thing. Like, they said, well, we're not just going to put this song out. We're going to play it for Mick Jagger and see what he thinks. That has to be a very unnerving thing. Even though Devo was very confident, it had to be unnerving. First of all, you're a friend of the guy who made that song legendary, and you're doing it totally different, and you're not sure how it's going to go. So how did it go with Devo and Mick Jagger on Satisfaction?
Yeah. So I don't know how they felt about playing it in front of them, but I think, you could guess it would have to be at least weird. And knowing them, either it would be intimidating or they would want to freak him out. Like, I could see Jerry Casale wanting him, almost to react in a negative way. But by all reports, Mick Jagger loved it, was dancing around to, like, this is cool. Like, this is such a cool reinvention of the song, and apparently he appreciated that. So
who and what is it? I'm saying Boogie Boy. Is it Boogie Boy or Booji Boy? Is it Boogie Boy?
Booji Boy is the
Booji Boy. How did that come about?
So, they were into masks, and then they were into going to thrift shops and finding weird stuff, and they were always playing around with the theatrics of performing. And so Mark found the Booji Boy mask I think it was in a Canton thrift store. It was around here, and it was grotesque, but also infantile. And so but once he started to wear it, he would become this character of Booji Boy, who was this sort of like guileless infant who, like, didn't know how corrupt the world was. And so he'd always be, like if a nuclear explosion happened in front of him, he'd be like, oh, look at the pretty color, so he's always like the voice of the innocent, with a sort of a cynical edge underneath it. But and that's been a part of their performance ever since. I mean, to this day, they end the show with Boogie Boys. It's a beautiful world. That song is one of my favorite Devo songs because its edge of satire is so perfect. It's kind of almost a tender song that's almost sad because the final line, "It's a beautiful world, but not for me." And there's almost like a sadness to that line. And when Boogie Boy sings it, it takes on a whole new life because you realize this is somebody who hasn't even had a chance to be corrupted yet. And when he says that line, it's almost like he's in a very de-evolution kind of way, doomed before he even has a chance. I think the greatest Bougie Boy moment, though, happens when so Devo was involved with making this god awful film called Human Highway, that was just like a vanity project of some Hollywood people, and somehow like Neil Young got sort of like pulled into the mix of people who were making this movie, and so did Devo, and so they were there was a camera rolling, and they just started jamming, and Neil Young had come up with this riff, and all he had was the riff, and it was dun, 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 into what eventually becomes Into the Black. And so while they're filming, Bougie Boy's in a crib with the Bougie Boy mask on, like the baby, or he's in a playpen, and the band's jamming around him. They're all wearing weird masks. It's a really kind of freaky scene. And Bougie Boy starts like going along with the riff, and he starts singing "Rust Never Sleeps," and that line becomes the name, like an iconic line of Neil Young's, and it came from Bougie Boy. And it's actually the reference is that a friend of the band's one of whom had become the roadies, family member had a muffler shop in Akron. And supposedly there was a sign on the side of the muffler shop that said "Rust Never Sleeps." And so, so it filters from Akron into just this spontaneous moment in this crib with Bougie Boy in the mask saying "Rust Never Sleeps," and it filters over into Neil Young's mouth and then into sort of rock and roll history. So
That's crazy.
From the mouths of babes.
From the mouths of babes. What do you think is their most underrated song?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Underrated. I mean, in a way, I would say it is "Beautiful World" because Devo had one hit, and they are not a one-hit wonder. I mean, they have a lot more depth to them. And I think that song, to me, is the song that sort of deserved. I mean, it's a really beautiful song, and it was so appropriate for its era, and it was a message song that I think, like I said before, kind of really delivered its message with that perfect blend of commentary, but also accessibility, where like "Through Being Cool," for example, is a message song that's really front loaded. We're through being cool. We're done with like the nerds are taking over, and that's a great statement song too. But I think "Beautiful World" is a more subtle song that also delivers musically, and for my money, should have been an even bigger hit than "Whip It."
Speaking of "Whip It," "Whip It" was it a blessing or a curse for the band?
Yes and yes. When they go through all of this bidding war and all of this turmoil with the music industry, and they finally sign with Warner Brothers, and but right away expectations are very high, and right away, I don't want to spoil some things in the book, but right away some things go very wrong, and so there's some pressure on Devo to deliver a hit that's going to validate what Warner Brothers has invested in them, and also kind of get them in the better graces of the music industry, an industry they never played along well with. So when "Whip It" happens, it gets up to number 14 on the Billboard charts, so pretty high profile. It does that. It gets them. It cements, or it satisfies that that need to prove to the record company that they were worth it, but immediately the pressure for another hit comes. And I don't agree with this, but some critics have said that Girl You Want was like a crass attempt to basically rip off the My Sharona riff. It's a very similar riff, but because that was the same moment My Sharona was a huge hit. That it was this crass attempt to write a hit for the purpose of writing a hit. I think it's a great song, and it's right if it fits right into what Devo does really well. But the idea is, now, they were better off when they were under the radar in terms of the industry, and now they're not. And so the pressure is different. And that is the beginning of the decline of their, peak of creativity. I think it's the beginning of them not having as much control. I mean, they were still are such a controlling band about their image, about their output, about their packaging, about everything about them. Again, blessing and a curse. Like it's part of who they are artistically, but it's also made them very hard to work with. So yeah, so Whip It was equal parts blessing and curse.